Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
And I'm Charlotte Kramer, a current undergraduate here at Stanford University.
And we have 4 of our faculty here who just ran a conference on human behavior and climate change. And colleagues, I'm going to ask each of you to go ahead and introduce yourselves and talk a little about the conference.
Sara Constantino, an assistant professor of environmental social sciences at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And I do work on the impacts of climate change on individuals, institutions, communities, as well as the impact individuals and collective action and policy have in addressing climate change.
Hi, I'm Madalina Vlasceanu. I'm an assistant professor of environmental social sciences at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. I also direct the Climate Cognition Lab. And in our lab, we think about psychological interventions to increase climate awareness and climate action around the world. And we think about what are the psychological theories and applications that can increase not only individual behaviors to take action, but also collective behavior and civic engagement to affect the system through advocacy.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Ardoin. I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Social Sciences group in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, where I run the Social Ecology Lab. We're an interdisciplinary group of researchers with backgrounds in anthropology, sociology, political science, psychology, and many other social science areas. We're interested in individual and collective action behaviors to address many different areas of sustainability. We are particularly interested in the ways that learning and connection to place influence individual and collective action behaviors. I'm also a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment.
I'm Helena Miton. I'm an assistant professor of organizational behavior here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I am a cognitive scientist by training, and I study cultural evolution. So my interest in climate change is as one of many challenges humankind has faced and is trying to adapt to.
All right. Well, thanks so much, colleagues. And Charlotte, you were at the conference. What struck you about this conference, the research presented?
Well, one thing that I would love to touch on just immediately is the role of knowledge in shaping human behavior and the role of learning. And I'd love to reference 2 of the talks in particular. One saying that, which sort of elaborated on that when knowledge of a new technology, so a new way to maybe remove carbon from the atmosphere, when that knowledge is low, people tend to really think of a solution as, oh, is it natural? Is it natural? Does it make sense for the environment? And if it's not natural, people perceive it as bad just because there's no knowledge. And another talk sort of touched on this point as well, emphasizing that when people do learn about climate change and the specific mechanisms of global warming, they really do see an increase in their preoccupation and how much they care about global warming and climate change. So that to me was super interesting, sort of understanding how much what people know impacts their behaviors.
Yeah, that is super interesting. What's your reflection on this, colleagues?
I would say, I think in the field of psychology, there's been this long-standing debate as to whether climate change has this information deficit issue, and all we need to do is just inform people, tell them about the mechanism of climate change, inform them about the consequences, and that will lead them to take action. And that has been a prevalent view throughout. And while some of these interventions that increase people's knowledge are successful in some contexts at increasing environmental behavior, climate concern, there has been a big body of work that has suggested the opposite, that presenting people with knowledge is actually not an effective strategy to get people to take more for environmental behaviors or to engage in climate action at the individual or collective level. So I think there's been this tension in the literature between these 2 camps. And more recently, researchers have started to try to understand what moderates. So what are the contexts in which information does or does not help? And at least one of those factors that matters is where are people standing to begin with. For example, how much knowledge do they already have? Or what is their political ideology? Are they already politically motivated to incorporate new knowledge about climate change and accordingly update their beliefs and behaviors in a way that aligns with the newly gained knowledge? Or are they of an ideological background, or are their identity tied to an ideological group that has been historically motivated to resist this kind of knowledge?
I would just add to that and say that even within the presentations in the workshop, I think there was also some evidence showing that information might not be enough, like Dr. Sharif's presentation, which showed that incentives were needed for spillovers for environmental behaviors. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was Terry Satterfield's work, which looked at lack of knowledge about direct air capture technologies, which showed that when people have low knowledge, then other factors like trust and who they're learning from are particularly important.
Tobias Brash also had some data suggesting that knowledge, or giving people heuristics as to how to more effectively evaluate, for example, things like which environmental behaviors are more effective versus less effective, didn't work at increasing even people's accuracy, and in addition, intentions to take climate action. So it still seems to be a little bit, there's this duality between findings, and I think a lot of research at the moment is still trying to understand what are those contexts in which you get one or the other with knowledge.
That one thing that struck me about this, and especially Madalina, as you make this point on the findings not always agreeing at this point, some of the data were about Americans, but other parts of many of the papers actually were about other data sets taken from other locations. And it made me think that, this is obviously a global issue, and we need to understand human behavior beyond the borders of any one country. And obviously, I'm an outsider to this kind of research. But what's your reaction to the fact that so much of the research, fortunately, comes from all different parts of the world?
For what it's worth, I think that was very much a design choice in which talks we chose to invite, because I think all of us are quite aware that probably our best path forwards is to be able to use the knowledge and adaptations that have happened locally and harness them for global change.
That's interesting. It's I was influenced, in fact, by papers by a number of the colleagues in this room to pay more attention to what's going on throughout the world. And I often say to people, you can't understand sustainability and stay in Palo Alto. And so in that spirit, Helena, as an expert in cultural evolution, what's your reaction to what we learned at the conference?
So I think one thing that really strikes me is kind of the diversity of strategy that have been reported to deal with climate change. We had very kind of classic North American cities initiative, about how to deal with heat waves in Boston. But we also had a lot, or at least quite a few talks that were talking about how migration is used, or at least happens as a reaction to climate change in very different contexts. So part of it was in Kenya, another part was in Bangladesh. So I think, mostly this kind of diversity of strategy you can find around the world is really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of migration as a strategy for coping, something that we often forget about.
Sort of just to jump on that talk about migration, I found it really interesting how Professor Carrico stressed the importance of connections and sort of the community that you have in the decision of whether or not to migrate. And it almost seemed to me like the decision to migrate, it was heavily impacted by sort of climate in the years before, but it was also really impacted by what are the people around you doing, and what kind of reactions do they have to the same situation. And then that, I think, kind of touches on the whole idea of coordination and cooperation and collective action, I guess, in human behavioral change.
that links to other themes that we saw throughout the conference, right? Which is even notions around social norms and how do we, both injunctive and descriptive social norms, what do we think others think about our decisions, and how do we make decisions based on what we believe that our community approves of us doing and expects us to do? Certainly in terms of migration, it's thinking about where in the future, someone asked about at the conference, one of the questions was about dynamic social norms. So where do we think that norm is moving in the future in light of changing conditions? Going back to one of the earlier questions about information and knowledge, how does that knowledge influence our choices? One of the things that struck me was that at this conference, we really focused on factual knowledge rather than procedural knowledge, which tends to focus on skills-based knowledge. Yet in terms of adaptation and migration, we're often really focused more on skills. What skills do we have that are in place here that make us successful here? And what skills do we have that could make us successful elsewhere, right? And that's something you often learn from your community. And you may expect that you could learn that from a community elsewhere, right? So those are things you can learn in terms of social norming as well as in terms of collective adaptation.
That links nicely to Ann Piser's talk in the sense that local adaptations might now be failing or insufficient, at least in northern Kenya. And so we have to look to these external solutions, like through migration or through these remittance networks.
I mean, the sort of geographic applicability of solutions was a big theme in a way that ran across a lot of the conference. If you think about it, and of course, obviously with changes in climate, behaviors that are working in one place won't work in another. That was certainly true in the case of Kenya, and we know that's true in other parts of the world with respect to agriculture and fisheries and so forth. One of the issues that came up with migration that was mentioned just as an aside was the link between migration and violence in households, domestic violence perpetrated by men in some situations. And we didn't elaborate on that in the conference. Would any of you like to elaborate on this?
Well, I would just say that violence has been found to increase in the context of climate change because of increased heat, but also because of increased pressures, stressors in the environment, fewer resources. So within a household, violence has been found to increase, but also more largely collectively between different groups or nations or types of people, however people sort themselves into outgroup violence is increasing as a direct result of climate change. And so that's not a theme that necessarily occurred in the conference, but it's just more of a broad phenomenon that has been documented.
But I think this does sort of touch on a different talk about the rise of left-wing authoritarianism, and the idea there that people who believe that companies or institutions have become recreant and aren't doing good enough things, aren't doing things correctly, that then leads to higher rates of violence and authoritarianism. And that's why in this paper that was presented, we saw people saying that, yes, they would love to have a strong militia leader to fight against climate change. And that is concerning, of course. Yeah. But then we look at the example of China, who are doing very well on sort of the climate front, and they're really putting a lot of effort into that, and sort of looking at it almost in the sense of, oh, maybe an authoritarian regime is better suited towards tackling climate change. But then, of course, we all love our democracies.
You know, there's an old thought that when autocracy is good, it can be really good, and when autocracy is bad, it can be really bad. And we'll be continuing that theme through a number of the conferences, so it won't come up only in this one. But that link between what we're doing as humans, our interventions to affect human behavior, and the larger political system within which we operate is one that all of us need to keep in mind as we think about grappling with climate change and the changes that are happening in the world around us. So what I'd like to do now, as we finish up, is to go around to each of you colleagues and let you reflect on the conference, on what we've learned in the conference, and for our listeners, your thoughts on what they should take away with respect to their role in dealing with the changes that the world is facing.
It's something that came up several times just in this last conversation. Was one of the places that we ended the conference saying that we thought there was more opportunities for conversation was around these questions of scale. So the conference was framed as a conversation looking at from individual to collective action. And a number of people in their talks were grappling with these challenges of where do we focus on individual action? Where do we focus on collective action? And then also thinking about how do we address successful interventions at scale. And there were some solutions that were floated, and yet also there were a lot of challenges that exist with thinking about how do we address sustainability challenges, and in particular areas of climate change at scale. So that seems like that's something that we as researchers can continue to grapple with, both theoretically and methodologically. And we would encourage those listening to also think about what does it mean to address these issues, both as individuals as well as part of a larger community.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Nicole. And now, Sara, why don't you take it from there?
Maybe just picking up on that, and also going back to a point that you had made at the just earlier, Bill, is the tension between these really place-based solutions, the need for these place-based solutions and local adaptations, and the need to scale. And so thinking about how to bridge those two or how to reconcile those tensions is something that I'm interested in, and I think came up in different ways in different talks. And then again, I think this issue of collective action and also thinking about how human behavior is shaped by the broader institutional context and the political context is really relevant, coming up across many of these different workshops, and also increasingly relevant here given the change in the administration. And so those are themes that I think came up that I'd like to keep thinking about.
Well, thank you for that. And Madalina?
Yeah, I think for me, it was interesting to see the diversity of intervention solutions that researchers have proposed, ranging from the information interventions that we were talking about earlier, but to other psychological pathways, such as social norms. So revealing the fact that most of us care about climate change, and most of us are concerned, and most of us are trying to take some sort of action. We just don't know exactly what to do, and we don't know that we don't know how many others are in this group and in this situation. And so correcting misperceptions around social norms, talking about heuristics and what are some of the ways in which we can teach people how to identify pro-environmental behaviors that can be effective. We've seen talks that have tried to increase pro-environmental behaviors in climate action through games. And here, I think we can tap a little bit more into thinking about collective action. And so some of these games that have been proposed are trying to mimic the actual sustainability trade-offs of you have a pool of common resources, and if everybody acts in their self-interest, then everybody loses as a collective. But if everybody trusts each other, then everybody gains as a collective. So it's this dilemma between acting in self-interest versus acting in the interest of the group. And I think here's where trust in institutions, trust in each other comes into play. And we've heard some talks on trust, and especially the one with the left-wing authoritarianism. I think my reaction to that one was a lot about, okay, trust in institutions and is decreasing. And so perhaps a good intervention pathway could be, instead of directly targeting some sort of climate action, to try to increase citizens' trust in their institutions and in democratic institutions.
Super interesting. Thank you for that. And Helena?
I think I have two main kind of take-home points. The first one is definitely figuring out those problems is going to be figuring out which kind of organization we need, because you and me being organizational scholars, there are definitely organizational structures that are more conducive to figuring out solutions versus implementing them. And I think there was also a bit of tension in some of the talks between those strategies that we can implement in the long run that need to be prepared versus what we need to do now and at scale. And I think there's definitely also a kind of meta-organizational problem that we need to figure out. Another point I was thinking of is in terms of like implementing things at scale, there's this model of cultural evolution in archaeology I really like called the cascade model of invention processes, meaning you usually have like one invention, and whenever you try to scale up that technology, that triggers this cascade of invention. And that was described in a paper in 2017 about the telegram. And I think that's like just a great point for saying we need to start now, because part of the invention and the figuring out process we need to do, we're going to be able to figure it out only when we start and when we're actually trying to implement things at scale.
You know, I love that you're finishing with this cascade imagery. In the last couple of years, I've been going to different organizations all over the world, and it's amazing how many apparently disconnected new innovations are happening in the organizational world applied to sustainability. It might be that we're in the middle of a cascade, but often you don't know these things until even after they've begun. So I hope that's exactly what we're seeing. Charlotte, as the voice of the 21st century, we want to finish with your thoughts.
Well, I think pretty much everyone has mentioned it already, but my biggest sort of worry, I guess, from the conference was how is this all going to come to scale? How is this going to work at scale? I've traveled a lot in my life. I feel like I know a lot about the world, and it's just so different in so many different places. There's so many different cultural contexts, societal norms, and if those are really what influences our behavior and our decision-making processes, then it seems almost impossible to me to sort of implement one solution at scale, because there is no one cultural human norm. There's no one human society. So yeah, scale, I guess.
Well put, Charlotte. Colleagues, Charlotte Kramer, and from me, Bill Barnett. Until next time.
The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.